Grey lists. Red notices, black notices, blue helmets. The international community certainly loves its colour almost as much as it loves its acronyms. And here in Malta, we also love colour, naturally. Look at this background. How can you not love colour?
But one colour we are not so fond of at the moment is the colour grey, and in particular, a certain grey list which has been making the press rounds in Malta.
It's been put on the grey list by an intergovernmental body called the Financial Action Task Force. In short, FATF, not FATF. FATF develops and promotes international standards that are aimed at combat money laundering, terrorism financing, and proliferation financing. It's come a long way since it was set up in 1989, having then just 16 member states and now having 39 member states. FATF also periodically issues naughty lists, or rather grey or black lists. Black or grey lists of countries that have strategic or severe anti-money laundering deficiencies. The idea is that criminals are very good at exploiting these deficiencies, and by putting a country on a grey list, it makes it more difficult for these terrorists and corrupt organizations to access finance. So how does FATF scare its members into obeying its non-binding standard? Well, FATF is sometimes called the Anti-Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Watchdog. Now, this is a very apt title because it's good at getting its states to implement its non-binding standards. It's very much like a dog with a deep bark but no bite. Let's begin with classic enforcement. For example, did you know that it is illegal to chew gum in Singapore, or it's illegal to ride a cow while drunk in Scotland? So what a state does is it enacts laws making these acts illegal, and it then attaches a fine or a penalty for not complying with these laws. So let's say you're riding a cow while drunk, or you're spitting out gum in Singapore, and a police catches you. You then are faced with a penalty, usually in the form of a fine. The idea is that people comply with these laws because they do not want to pay fines or go to prison. Okay, so we've established that there are no penalties for not abiding with FATF standard. But then what makes a member state want to comply? In a nutshell, peer pressure. You may be thinking that FATF is like that high school kid who, through peer pressure, convinced you and your friends that it was cool to dye your hair blue like Marge from The Simpsons. Well, not exactly.
The peers are mainly country, and the tool used to exert pressure is what is known as mutual evaluations. And the pressure comes from the consequences of drastically failing to meet FATF standard. There are naturally several consequences that come with being put on this list. One of the consequences is reputational. Being put on this list increases the perception of a country's risk profile, meaning that investors are more reluctant to do business in a country that has been grey listed. A second consequence is capital flows. A possibility of being grey listed is what is known as de-risking. This is a process whereby banks exit or do not even begin relationships with customers in jurisdictions that have been grey listed. And this is done because of compliance costs. Conversely, it becomes more expensive for customers to have bank accounts in a grey listed country. Now, very often we talk about this as an economic issue, but in actual fact, it's also a social issue. If it becomes harder to access services, such as remittance services, then migrants in a country might find it more difficult to send money back home. Last thing I'll say here is think of all the projects that have been funded by the EU in Malta. Long term, this may impact a country's economy, with a May 2021 IMF report suggesting that money flowing into a country can decrease by about 7.6% of a country's GDP. In the case of Malta, this could be 1 billion euros per year. I'll let that sink in for a little bit.
Malta has been put on this list, but Malta's not even a member state, so how did this even happen in the first place?
FATF conducts reviews of its members and members of its FATF-style regional bodies. It then assesses technical compliance with its recommendations, and it looks at how they're implemented in practice, meaning how a country's laws and systems are effective at combating criminal abuse of the financial system. A country that has been put on the grey list is a country that has been put under increased monitoring by the FATF at one of its triannual meetings. Once grey-listed, a country must work with FATF to develop an action plan for addressing its deficiencies. In June 2021, Malta was grey-listed. It was the first EU country to ever be grey-listed. Now, this is not only shocking, but it's embarrassing. FATF has given us 3 points on which we can focus to hopefully make the situation better. What more do we need than a journalist dying and being put on this grey list for us to finally listen to the international community's wake-up calls? So the grey list is basically like Santa's naughty list, and a country that has been put on the grey list is like a naughty kid who's trying to change its behavior in time for Christmas. Malta's on the naughty list, but the consequences are certainly no laughing matter. As a first step, we as citizens are not helpless. We need to become more aware of what the consequences are. A second step is holding our politicians and our government and institutions to these high anti-money laundering standards. Ultimately, robust anti-money laundering standards allow for a government to be more transparent and have better institutions. And if Malta does not comply with this grey list, it's us as citizens who suffer. It is us who will be receiving the coal in the form of a weakened economy. Please subscribe below and like my video.